Jedi Fallen Order, the next big single-player adventure from Respawn Entertainment, has just hit. And last week, we took a look at the game running on Xbox One and Xbox One X. But of course, we finally got our hands on the PS4 version. I have some additional thoughts to share and test results of those versions of the game. And I wanted to bring in Richard Ledbetter, my good buddy here, to talk about it. So Richard, how's it going this morning?
Absolutely fantastic, and I'm kind of curious to see your results here because I've been busy on other projects this week, but I've been really looking forward to this game, principally because it's Respawn, and from my perspective, it's almost like a Midas touch when it comes to perhaps not ultra high-end tech, but certainly in terms of the experience, in terms of the feel. These guys know what they're doing, so...
I tend to agree, yeah. So Jedi Fallen Order, I've continued to play it. I really, really like it. I think it's an excellent game. It's really this crazy fusion of Dark Souls and Metroid and maybe Tomb Raider and all these types of action-adventure games that it brings it together in a really interesting way that still feels fresh. It has that Star Wars atmosphere that you would expect that's actually really effective. And, you know, honestly, I love the backtracking. I love, like, the puzzles you solve, the combat. It's all really, really well done. I'm having a blast with the game.
So I think a lot of people were possibly expecting like a linear action game similar to Uncharted, but it sounds something very, very different.
It really is, and it does have those elements of an Uncharted style game, but it's all that's around the periphery, if you will, where it's really focused on going into these huge, super complex levels. I mean, when you pull up the sort of like hollow map and try to look around at your progress, it gets really complicated, and it's really cool. It does honestly remind me of something like Metroid Prime. You're just going deeper and deeper, and there's some great platforming and puzzles and action, and it's awesome. But of course, as you know, has become clear, there are some technical hiccups that vary kind of based on both the platform you're playing on and, in fact, your individual console.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big takeaway from what we were discussing earlier is variability, even on the same platform. And this is a bit of a problem that I'm kind of surprised to see in a Respawn game, but I get the sense that they're really pushing Unreal Engine 4 perhaps in some uncomfortable directions here, and not from the usual perspective of CPU or GPU.
Yes, I think everything seems to center around I/O operations, or at least shuttling data to and from memory for use in the game. Because from what I'm seeing, I mean, the main issue and the cause of slowdown that we found on Xbox, it was always tied into loading in new data. Well, maybe not on the S, where there was actually lots of slowdown during normal gameplay as well, but the traversal stuff, moving between areas, there's freezing, there's hiccups and dips, and it always seems to tie into that. But my experience wasn't actually that bad. But I've been looking at other people playing the game, and including one of Eurogamer's reviewers, Emma, who took a look at the game. She was having serious problems on her base Xbox One and had to switch to Xbox One X much later because it was actually just completely seizing up at certain sequences. And that's kind of the thing I'm gathering here, is it's like depending on the health of your hard drive, whether you're using internal or external, and various other factors all around it, you may or may not have a great experience there. And that's really weird, because when we test games at Digital Foundry, of course, I always make sure I have a fresh boot. I've rebooted the system. Everything's clean. I run the game fresh. Try to minimize the potential disruptions so that you can really test the game the way, you know, it kind of makes sense. You don't want sleep mode interfering with it, because especially on Xbox One, that can be a serious issue, as you know.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting topic because, as you say, we try to basically analyze the software. And the danger is that if we've got suboptimal hardware, we're not reviewing the experience that the developer put together, but rather we're sort of biasing the results by deficiencies in our hardware, which isn't really what I want to do. But at the same time, there are obviously issues with this one, and there's a spread of performance even on the same platform. And obviously this is a bit kind of weird, because you know the whole concept of a console is it's a fixed hardware platform. Every machine should act like every other machine out there.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what we're not finding with this game. But I think to continue the discussion, we need to talk about the PlayStation 4 version. That's what people want to hear about. I've been spending as much time as I could with this version of the game. It has the day one patch, which is 1.02, installed now. And here's what I found. First, resolution, of course. PlayStation 4 Pro in the quality mode, which was 1440p on Xbox One X. It's around 1260p instead on the Pro. But I spent more time looking at different shots, and it does actually seem to use a dynamic resolution system, and it seems to top out at 1260p or roughly around there, but it can also drop closer to 1080p and possibly even below in some instances. And then going back to it, it does seem like this also applies to Xbox One X. It's just very subtle and hard to catch. Both of them, though, use Unreal's temporal upsampling feature, so you do get the impression of a higher overall resolution. Then, of course, there's the performance mode, which is interesting. So in this one, the frame rate is uncapped, but the maximum resolution is reduced to 1080p. And here, PS4 Pro seems to use a more aggressive dynamic resolution system, so it does drop below 900p from what I've seen.
Good stuff.
And hitting 1080p in other instances. Whereas I had a tough time going back to Xbox One X and finding anything under 1080p. Of course, it's always possible, but the drops are more noticeable on the PS4 Pro. And also, there's some differences in terms of visual quality as well. The anti-aliasing isn't quite as strong, the SSR isn't quite as refined, and distant LODs pop in closer to the camera. So they're pretty similar, but there's definitely some improvements on the X version in terms of overall quality. So even though they both sort of specify 1080p in the options menu, the X does have an advantage.
Okay, so I saw your Xbox video. The Xbox One base system and the S is 720p native resolution, again with that temporal upscaling technique. What about the base PS4?
Well, I think you can probably guess this one.
I did guess it. When we were talking on Slack earlier, I said, I bet it's 900p.
You're correct. It's pretty much 900p, though, again, kind of like we saw with the Pro, there does appear to be dynamic resolution, which can drop below 900p, but 900p seems to be the typical resolution. It seems to sort of vary between 720 and 900p. Whereas every shot I counted on the Xbox One S came in at 720p, I do have to wonder, though, if it can go lower, but I didn't see any examples of that.
Okay, and well, let's go back to the I/O thing, because that does seem to be improved on the enhanced consoles. And does that extend to PlayStation as well?
Okay, so yeah, there's multiple aspects to the performance here, so let's start with discussing this. As I noticed in the Xbox video, there was a lot of this on the S versus the X. And it is, in fact, similar here on the Pro versus base PS4 versus all the other systems. The Pro isn't bad. In fact, I did encounter a couple of these at one point on the Pro, but it was actually rather rare. And I feel like overall the I/O stutters weren't too bad in my experience. So I can't fault it too much there. But again, it's one of those variable kind of things. But for me, it's not bad. And I did go to Kashyyyk. Thanks to Thomas over on Twitter, who actually helped me out getting a save there, because reaching that planet takes quite some time, and since I didn't have a lot of time with the PS4 version, this helped me get to some of the more difficult and demanding sections of the game.
Right,
and the Pro actually holds up quite well. So they're very, very similar. Base PS4, it sort of sits somewhere between the two, I would say, in terms of the I/O stuttering. It definitely does occur, but it doesn't seem to occur as often as the S. Like, there's a scene here where I climb up over this ledge and just kind of continue along. This got me every single time on the S, and it was exactly the same here on the base PS4. But I did actually run into this. If you remember when I showed Xbox One S, there was the sequence where you move into the wall there between the pipes, and the entire game world is sort of blanked out for a second while it loads in the new assets. That also...
Yeah, I had a sort of PUBG flashback there when it was in beta.
That's right. Yes, I remember. Yes. When you were there and you could see everything and I couldn't see anything. That was a moment. But yes, the same thing happens here on the base PS4, though the assets still load in faster. So it doesn't last as long, but it is there. And I do feel like that kind of thing can happen more on the two base consoles. They just seem to struggle to keep up in general, I've found.
Mm-hmm.
But weirdly enough, I actually did, just for a test, I loaded up the game on an external drive on the Xbox, specifically a lower speed 2.5 inch drive that I had, plugged it in via USB and fiddled around, and I was able to produce some of these pauses and stutters that I saw on all the other systems as well.
Right, okay.
So I'm kind of going to say that the two upper tier consoles, when played from a local drive, is probably the best way to go.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that sounds fair enough. I mean, we're talking about I/O stutter pretty conclusively, and well, your test there to actually try different external drives does pretty much confirm that it is related to storage.
Yeah, I think so. And again, there's drive health to consider, how full your drive is, you know, the way everything's sort of like written on the drive. There's so many different issues that can crop up with this. There's always variability with the storage medium. And I think that they're just running the game with like such a razor thin margin of there, you know, that it just can't deal with these issues. When the storage can't quite keep up, the game has to pause like this. So
well, this is a difficult one because I believe that they are promising fixes, but it's going to require pretty fundamental optimization of the streaming systems to accommodate for all of those different drives.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It's going to be a lot of work. Whereas on the other hand, though, the normal frame rate that you encounter during just regular action, battle, that sort of stuff, things are looking much better there. So PS4 Pro in quality mode does hold 30 frames per second just about all the time. It's very similar to the Xbox One X. The only time it tends to dip is when there's those little I/O stutters. Sometimes even when they're just minor, you might get a little hitch or skip along the way, at least on my system. I did get a little bit of slowdown here in this one battle, but again, it's relatively stable. Not a big deal, and thanks to the excellent motion blur, it actually feels very nice. But the performance mode, on the other hand, is the one that I'm not a huge fan of. So I wasn't a fan of this on the X, and I'm not a fan of it here, although in both cases it could be considered future-looking for next-generation backwards compatibility. Then when it comes to actually comparing the performance mode between X and Pro, they do appear to be very similar overall, and I kind of noticed it varying by scene. In some scenes, the Pro has an advantage, and in other scenes, the X has an advantage, and it just sort of seems to vary based on what's being displayed at any one point. But the difference between them is typically quite small, you know, maybe just like 2 or 3 frames at most of the time. So it doesn't really feel like either one has a huge advantage over the other, and neither version is very smooth. It just feels very juddery and sort of hitchy as a result. And so for me, at least, you know, in its current form, I'm really not a big fan of the performance mode, and I really wouldn't use it myself.
Well, you know, it's all about consistency. I think I prefer consistency over wild variations in frame rate, and that's kind of been our bugbear with performance modes pretty much across the board since the enhanced consoles came along. The games aren't, fundamentally the games aren't designed around that performance target. So it's kind of like a bolt-on value add at the end as opposed to a fundamental part of the design. And if you stack it up against, say, the Shadow of the Colossus remake, where the performance mode was a design target and it works beautifully, then the difference with this kind of implementation is stark.
Plus, this is sort of a Souls-like game, right? And it does kind of run better than anything From Software has produced this generation. I mean, the average frame rate is kind of similar to the Pro Enhanced and X Enhanced version of games like Sekiro, which run unlocked. It's similar to that, but those games do not have a 30 FPS cap option on the Pro consoles, and on the base consoles where you do get that, you have the really bad frame pacing issues, which are not a problem here. So this does run and feel better in motion than any of From Software's games, which, just a side note, but that's something to consider.
Mm-hmm. So we've got I guess the usual sort of showing from the console power ladder here in terms of overall turnout.
Yes, and that applies to the base PS4 as well, which only has the 30 FPS mode. It does indeed drop frames more often than the Pro, but I found that it was overall much more stable than the S. Again, this battle here with the spiders and the stormtroopers seemed to be a really difficult spot for all the consoles and sort of really pushed them all. And here the S really, really dropped low. But on the base PS4, it's not too bad. I mean, it's not stable, but it could certainly be worse. So in that sense, like you said, the power ladder is in effect here. And the game, at least in that sense, behaves as you would expect. The only real wild card stems entirely from all these IO-related stutters and hitches and pausing. And I think all the issues that people are encountering with the game and noticing now that they have their hands on it tie into that.
Okay, which is kind of fascinating because it is seemingly varying on a machine-by-machine basis.
Yeah, and it does indeed, and it does make the game just feel glitchier overall. The worse the stutters and I/O issues get, the more glitches you seem to encounter. So there's really an issue there in terms of fetching data, it seems. Presuming that is the issue, but that's what it seems like to me, at least from the outside.
And on the enhanced side of things, we recommend quality mode for both, and I guess the Xbox One X has a small lead there in terms of visual features and resolution.
Yep, it's fairly subtle, I'd say, but yeah, it's a little bit sharper, and the effects are slightly improved, and the general image quality is better. So, but again, the main thing just comes down to, I think, both X and Pro offer a really nice 30 FPS experience, provided your drives can keep up. And I would recommend them for that reason. I mean, it has its issues, but I still think there's a really solid game here.
Good stuff. One thing I do want to pick you up on, something we discussed the other day. You were saying that if you marked the experience, because at the time you had the Xbox One S and the Xbox One X, which are at the extreme ends of the console power ladder, you were saying that you would actually score the S version lower than the X, and this kind of is interesting to me because although there are technical differences in almost every multi-platform game, I think developers have reached the point now where for the most part it is fundamentally the same experience, and you would presumably mark it in much the same way. But in this one, you actually found the technical limitations to be actually impacting your enjoyment of the game. Is that right?
Absolutely. If I, at this point, decent ways in, I haven't finished the game yet, but I'm making my way there. I would say I would give Xbox One X PS4 Pro version maybe around an 8 or a 9 out of 10. I really, really like it. It's great stuff. On Xbox One S, though, I might be inclined to say like 6 out of 10, maybe 7 if I'm feeling generous, only in the sense that so much of the great stuff is just sort of spoiled by these constant and persistent issues that pop up. It really, really hurts the gameplay experience.
Okay, well, that's a bit of a downer to end on, but I think the thing we need to sort of stress is that the actual game itself, if you can liberate it from the technical issues, it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I guess the only question for me remains the PC version. Haven't had a chance to check it out yet, but presumably with the right hardware, you should be able to hit those higher frame rates with relative ease, and that may end up being the place to play it. But at the same time, we know that Unreal Engine has a history on PC, depending on the game, of introducing IO-related stutters as well. So we're going to have to see how that plays out, I suppose. I'm certainly curious, though.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting stuff then. And I think we should maybe just have a quick word about the HDR, because you've been playing it in your own time on HDR.
Yes, during the capture I've been in SDR, but then switching back to HDR while continuing to play on my own. And I think it's a really good implementation. It doesn't stand out as much as, say, like Gears 5, for instance, which is just unbelievable. But it does look really, really good. You get the highlights where you'd expect. There's more depth in the image, and everything just looks really vibrant. And I did feel like I was losing something when switching to SDR. The game just has a somewhat flatter appearance comparatively. So I guess it just made me stop and think that there are more games lately that have been releasing that are shipping with HDR modes. And more often, they're also quite good. I mean, another recent game from EA, Need for Speed Heat. I think that's their second game to support Dolby Vision. It looks phenomenal. And I mean, there's just been a run of games lately that are offering really nice HDR support, and I'm happy to see that, and I hope the trend continues, because I really do think it adds a lot to the overall presentation.
Good stuff. Well, I don't really know what to take away from this one. I think it's almost bittersweet in a way, because I think Respawn have done a really good job on the game, but the technical issues, they are concerning, and it's actually a bit upsetting that seems to be the main story at launch rather than the quality of the game.
Yeah, it's definitely a situation where it feels like the game needed another 3 months or so, perhaps. Like, there's just not quite the polish there that you would like. But the core game is really, really well done, and I do think it's worth playing, and in fact, it's probably the best single-player Star Wars game since at least Republic Commando, if not Jedi Knight. I mean, I'm really enjoying it up there with those types of games, and it's been a long time since there's been a really engaging Star Wars experience, so I am having a good time here.
2 or 3 generations.
Yes, exactly. All right, so I guess that's going to do it for now, though, so thanks for joining me, Rich.
No probs.
And if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, ring the notification bell for instant updates from Digital Foundry, and of course, come follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.